we're going to get started. My name is Rabbi Melanie Lavav, and I have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Shomer Collective. It's great to see so many of you who have been to some of our programs before, and it's great to see new faces too. For those of you who are new, I want to tell you a little bit about Shomer Collective before we launch into tonight's program. Shomer Collective is a nonprofit startup organization launched in response to the recognition that so many of us, too many of us, wind up in places we wish we wouldn't have been around end of life, in situations that end up being a crisis, in situations where we wish we know what mom would have wanted, but she's no longer able to communicate, and the siblings don't agree on the answer to the doctor's questions. And out of the recognition that Jewish wisdom has so much to offer around end of life. And so our work is focused on improving end of life care and conversations, guided by, inspired by Jewish wisdom. And part of the way that we do that is through public education programs like tonight's program. This is the second in our two-part series about hospice. And our program about hospice emerged in response to questions that so many of you had reached out to us and told us what you needed to know more about, what you wanted to know more about, what your experiences had been. And we're so glad to be able to respond to the needs as you've expressed them. And so with that, I am happy to introduce my colleague, Gila Silverman, who will facilitate tonight's program.
Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people here. We were a little bit overwhelmed by the number of people who registered for tonight's program, which tells us that there is a tremendous interest and hunger for these conversations about Jewish spiritual care at the end of life. I'm Gila Silverman. I'm the Education Program Manager at Shomer Collective. I'm joining tonight from Tucson, Arizona, where it is early evening. As Melanie mentioned, this is our second part of this conversation about hospice care. Last week, we focused on the practicalities of hospice, on the types of care and how to access that care. And tonight, we're going to focus on different kinds of options for Jewish spiritual care for people who are in the hospice, engaged with hospice and end-of-life care. Those of you who were here last week heard me say that this is personal for many of us, for me, like many of us. Both of my parents benefited from the support of a home hospice team at the end of their lives. And just about this time, exactly 2 years ago, I was sitting with my father as he entered the last weeks of his life at home, thankfully, and with the support of a really phenomenal hospice team that allowed us to support him in his wishes. We were really lucky to have that support, not only of a hospice team, but also of a very engaged and supportive synagogue community. But despite that, there was so much we didn't know to ask for or didn't know that we needed. So tonight, I want to dedicate our learning to all of those who do this sacred work of accompanying the dying and their caregivers. And in doing so, often fill needs that most of us don't even know we have. I'm honored that we have one of those people, Rabbi Natan Fenner, with us tonight. Rabbi Fenner is a spiritual care provider and board-certified chaplain who has supported people facing serious illness and end-of-life concerns in hospices, hospitals, at home, and in long-term care settings for over 25 years. I have known Natan for many years, and he is one of my role models for what it means to truly be present with people at some of their most difficult moments in life. And I say that not to embarrass you, Natan, but to honor you and the model that you provide for all of us. So welcome, Natan. Thank you for being with us. Our evening tonight is going to be structured as a conversation. I'm going to start us off with a few conversations, and then we will open it up to questions from all of you. Let's start off with a general question. What is spiritual care? What is spiritual care in general? What is Jewish spiritual care? And what does it mean in this context when we're talking about spiritual care at the end of life?
Well, first of all, thank you for that kind invitation. And grateful to be a part of this gathering and addressing these questions. So spiritual care is care around whatever we consider to be spiritual or spiritually supportive in our lives, which means many things to many people. For some people, spirituality is about the ineffable. It's about our transcendent meditative or other experiences. For some people, spirituality is about how we feel connected with others in our lives, those who came before, those who might come after us, where we are in the span of generations. For some people, spirituality is very tactile. It's how we experience the world, you know, swimming or mountain climbing, or the visual, the audio, the bird songs, the sound of a cat or an infant is what uplifts or softens and tenderizes our hearts. And spirituality is also can be very much about our identity at our core, who we are, what our questions are, what is mysterious to us, as well as what are the answers. Probably much more of the questions than the answers.
Yeah.
And so spiritual care is that whole constellation of who we are and responding to that, responding to those needs, to those yearnings, at any point in our lives, but of course, in this context, particularly at the end of our lives.
Okay. Wow, that's many, many different things, right? Which is what spirituality is. So when we're thinking about this in a Jewish context, and specifically about Jewish spiritual care, are there particular Jewish values, wisdom, perspectives that inform or can inform people's decisions about engaging with hospice care or not engaging with hospice care, or that the kinds of things that they might want to put in place as they engage with hospice? And I realize that's several questions combined.
Yeah, so Judaism, Jewish tradition highly values the concept of kavod, of honoring our elders, honoring life, choosing life, comforting one another. And hospice can be one of the ways to respond to that drive, that mitzvah, that yearning in our lives, to depending on where a person is and what their desires are. Hospice offers an extra degree of care and support and personalized attention, and attention particularly to pain and comfort, and not only an individual and their medical needs, but a holistic sense of their family or home or key social relationships and environments, and planning for and supporting what will make me comfortable at the end of my life, what will afford me the maximum dignity at the end of my life, and connection with the people that I care about. So hospice is not necessarily the only answer, and it can be part of the answer, or the answer to those questions might direct someone in a different direction as well. But for those who are acknowledging death as a part of life and want to choose life by accepting that and using time to draw others close, and who feel that perhaps certain kinds of medical care might no longer be appropriate, and wanting to focus on quality of life together, hospice may be a very important part of that answer, and very rooted in Jewish values.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that comes up a lot in the work we do, and has come up in some of the questions that came in, prior to this program, and in our conversation last week, is most people engaging with hospice are not going to be in a Jewish hospice. That's true for most of us in terms of the communities we live. So how can someone make the hospice experience a more Jewish experience? And I say Jewish in quotes because I realize that can mean many different things to many people. But what kinds of things can people bring in?
So I'll start by saying that hospice organizations and hospice providers are not uniform across the country and in every given community, but the general hospice philosophy is to be attentive to you, to the person, to the family, to the unit. The unit of care is not the person, but the system, including the immediate caregivers and those most affected or living with the person who's dying. And so part of the hospice philosophy is to assess in a very holistic way a person's medical needs, comfort and care needs, quality of life, desires and supports, and for the rest of the system as well. And that's emotionally, medically, physically, and spiritually. And so one of the things that you can do if you want to have Jewish care or Jewishly supportive care at the end of life is to verbalize your needs or your questions. I don't know what I can ask for, but I'm a person who always, for whom this matters. Or, I always light candles on a Friday night, and now I'm on oxygen, and then maybe I can't do that, but I still want to respect that rhythm in my life, or that would still be meaningful. It's still meaningful to be in touch with my grandchildren or members of my chavra from years ago, or I have some end of life reflection. It's kind of like my Yom Kippur moment in my life, and I want to be supported in that because I don't feel like I can do it myself at this time. So there may be rituals, there may be questions, there may be music, there may be community connections that the person who's entering hospice or the family or the caregivers can say, these are important to me. Can we talk about what part of that hospice, the hospice providers can support or help me connect with?
What kinds of things in terms of rituals, traditions that people can bring into the hospice room, whether it's at home or in a residential setting? What kind of Jewish rituals are most common that you see brought into that setting that people find meaningful? You mentioned Shabbat candles, right? So what does someone do? Let's say they want Shabbat candles, but as you pointed out, they're on oxygen, or there's some other reason why they can't have candles. So what can you do in those situations, and what are some other rituals that people might commonly ask for or not know they can ask for?
So I'll answer the Shabbat candle question
Easy.
first, just because that's very concrete.
Yes.
There are many places now where one can find battery operated candles or plug-in candles, and some of them look like traditional candlesticks, and some are little tea lights. And so there are lots of options readily available and very inexpensive. And you don't get the smell of sulfur from striking the match, but you can still have the glow of two lights or however many you're used to, and that affirmation not only for yourself and the opportunity to say blessings, but an opportunity to share that if there are others in your environment too, and to affirm that rhythm and the spirituality or the meaning or the comfort of Shabbat, if that's been a practice for you. If I can answer more generally, a lot of what people bring in or can bring in, ideally, is an expression of what was meaningful in your life before. If Shabbat was meaningful in your life before, a taste of Manischewitz or the candles or a taste of challah, and you're physically able to still enjoy that, then it would be special to do that. If you're coming up on Passover and you can't necessarily eat all of the things or travel all the traditional foods, but can zoom in or have a phone call with someone and have a taste of some of the foods, or be able to sing Dayenu with somebody, or to think on a metaphorical, intellectual level, what kind of sea am I crossing right now? What does that mean in my life? How do I share that with others? There's such richness in so many aspects of our tradition, but a lot of it will depend. What did you do? Did you read a Jewish paper? Did you listen to Jewish music? Did you so was that meaningful to you? Would it still be meaningful? Maybe you can't read anymore, but somebody can read to you. There's maybe you don't have access to to the something, a physical item, but there can be a substitute or a visual for it in your environment. So there are many ways that that we can bring in what was meaningful, what might be meaningful to us, what might be comforting, what might be connecting, that is connected to ritual or connected to other parts of our lives that we identify as Jewish. It could be giving tzedakah. It could be writing a letter to a government representative, because I was always an activist for causes that were, to me, tikkun olam, about repairing the world. So they're all, that shouldn't have to stop just because we're on hospice. And some of those things may drop by the wayside. They're less core to me now, and some of them may be as important and as affirming as ever, and maybe even more so, more poignant at this time in my life.
Right. So the most important thing, which feels like stating the obvious, but we need to state, right, is that it's going to be different for every person. Right. And it's it's listening for what's meaningful. Right. Listening for what's meaningful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about sort of obvious Jewish activities, or symbols and rituals, or sensory inputs. But they're also, how do we live out our values? If some of our values are about connecting and honest communication with family, or shalom bayit, keeping the peace in family, there may be opportunity to do that differently, but we may want to uphold that in some way in the hospice setting as well.
Right. Someone is commenting that at their hospice I think this is outside of Baltimore, they have Velcro on the doorways so they can attach a mezuzah if someone wants that, but it's not there if they don't, because not all patients are Jewish, I think, in that hospice. As well as they have electric candles and a kosher kitchen available for those who want. And someone else is commenting that you might have audiobooks, Jewish podcasts, Jewish music, right, playing in the room. And I'm just going to acknowledge, as I mentioned, we're nearing my father's yard site, the anniversary of his death. And in the last days of his life, it was Passover. And so at Seder, we weren't sure, was he going to make it to Seder? And then would he make it after Seder? So he didn't make it to the Seder table, but he could hear the Seder from his bed. And that became very important. And he had no interest in the matzah or the gefilte or the soup or like any of the foods that were important. He had great interest in the flourless chocolate cake at the end of the Seder. And that turned out to be, I'm now sharing it with all of you, that turned out to be the last solid food that he ate, was the Passover chocolate cake. So you never know what's going to be meaningful, right? And it's important, as you say, to just make all of these things available. Another comment says putting on tefillin or talit, right? For someone for whom that is I guess I was going to say for someone for whom that is a regular practice, but it might also be someone who that was not a regular practice, but it could be meaningful in that moment, right?
I have been with people who were not at all practicing religiously, but who at the end of their lives wanted to say Shema with family members, and especially with the next generation present, or to hear the next generation say Shema and say, okay, something was transmitted that's of vital importance to me. Sometimes it's the familiar, and sometimes hospice gives us the excuse, the opportunity, the invitation to also try something new, to unstick ourselves from a rut if we're in one, or something we've longed to do, or something that somebody offers that I hadn't done that before, but that sounds like a lovely idea. And it could be even the non-Jewish hospice chaplain says, I've heard people do this. Would that be of interest to you? And you say, oh, that sounds lovely.
Yes, right. And I see there's a question that just came to me, which is exactly the question I was about to ask you. So we're all on the same page here, clearly. When you mentioned the Shema, that immediately also takes me to the Vidui, the confessional. So, and I think this is something that is, at least in my experience, is something that many non-Orthodox Jews were not familiar with and seems to be kind of making a comeback, if you can call it that. I'm not sure that's the right term, but it's becoming more known. So can you talk a little bit about the Vidui and what it is, when it's offered, who can do it, and what it might mean to people, as you said, who maybe don't even know that it exists?
Yes, thank you. There are a number of Jewish liturgical resources that can be very meaningful at the end of life, or contemplating the end of life. And one of them is Vidui, which is translated sometimes as acknowledgement or as confession. There are different forms of a Vidui in different prayer books. There's a Vidui that we say for the High Holy Days that's very much about all the ways I've gone wrong. There's a Vidui. We're encouraged to say Vidui in some communities every night when we go to bed, and we're sort of like releasing our soul into the unknown, and wanting to ask forgiveness for anyone that we have wronged or harmed, and also let go of resentments and things that might have built up in us from being on the receiving end for others. And there's a Vidui also for the end of life. And there are many contemporary variations and interweavings of those that can be found online. Anita Diedmont in her Kaddish book has a couple of Vidui examples at the end. Many synagogues and many prayer books will have versions. And some of the themes of a Vidui, and there's shorter and longer versions too. Some of the themes are acknowledgement, where at end of life, something about my path forward is no longer in my hands, and asking for or seeking healing, forgiveness. It's an opportunity for sharing blessing. For the forgiveness can go both directions. A person who's dying saying, I forgive to others, and vice versa. And if there's something that we haven't spoken of that we want to get to and to release in the moment. When I've brought in a Vidui, when I've offered Vidui to somebody who's dying and to those around them, it's usually not, let's just read through this. It's usually, let's pause. There's a theme here about forgiveness. Is there anything you want to say? It's using the Vidui liturgy as a springboard to sharing those deeply heartfelt wishes, prayers, blessings, requests, reflections. It's an opportunity for shared blessing and wishes for each other, and an opportunity also to say Shema together and affirm the oneness that has encompassed and transcends any one of our lives and that connects us deeply, so deeply as well.
Yeah. For those who haven't seen it, there's a movie that was made by one of our Shomer partners, Rabbi. It's about the family of Rabbi Rachel Timoner. It's called Last Flight Home, and it's there's a scene in the movie where she does. It's not a vidui, but it is a vidui. It's what you're talking about. There's an opportunity. They have a conversation about the regrets and the pride, and reflecting on a life, what it means to have a life well lived. It's a powerful scene. So if you haven't seen the movie, highly recommend it. Just as one more example of how these things can play out in that setting. I know that there's a lot of people on the call tonight who are end-of-life doulas and hospice volunteers, and I think some chaplains and people in many other roles. And so I'm wondering, are there things that specifically someone might want to call in a rabbi, or are these things that anyone who is in the room can offer and can learn about and bring into their interactions with people at the end of their lives, and specifically in hospice settings?
So a lot of what we're talking about today does not require a rabbi, really. I wouldn't say that anyone can do it, because there's a certain amount of both training or familiarity with the resources that's very helpful, that some people, end of life doulas and trained hospice volunteers among them, and many rabbis and cantors. or other Jewish spiritual care providers have the comfort and the familiarity and the sort of the ease of access to offer or to tailor to a specific situation, to a specific person. But having said that, for one of the wonderful things about end-of-life doulas and hospice staff is generally a comfort and an experience with the manifestations of end-of-life and end-of-life experience. There's so much about hospice that is so important and so compelling, and that we want to offer each other and that we hold up as Jewish values in the community, but if a person is not comfortable sitting by the bedside in that situation, then the energy and what they're able to offer is going to be more constrained. And we can't, and we're not, and we don't all have that comfort, and it's different when you're a professional than when it's your family member in the room. Sometimes harder, sometimes easier, more layered. If it's a community member, if it's somebody you've known for a long time. So there are many reasons why it's just that old phrase, it takes a village. It's good to have options. It's good to have more than one person to go to. And people have different ideas too, and different relationships. You and I might, because of our relationship, think of certain resources to draw on, and because of somebody else's relationship in the community, they're thinking of something else, or they bake in a certain way that or have certain shared experiences that we can reflect on and recall together, that are also adding to the beauty and the richness that cannot be accessed at the end of life.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions about how we decide when to engage with hospice. And, there's a question about, are there guidelines for determining when to start end-of-life care, or how might we talk to people who are considering hospice? There are medical guidelines, right? And there are Medicare guidelines, and there are insurance guidelines. We talked about many of those in the presentation last week, and some of those you can also find, specific to your state. So I'm going to qualify this a little bit and ask, are there Jewish guidelines, or are there Jewish principles that can help us determine when does someone kind of shift into what we might call end-of-life care? And are there ways that we can either texts or ethical values that we can use when talking to people in the Jewish community who are considering hospice and aren't sure?
So I'm going to loop back to the conversation about Vidui for just a moment as a preface to this. There's a statement in Pirkei Avot, and what the text sometimes referred to as the ethics of the fathers, that encourages us to repent, to seek repentance, to make teshuvah a day before our death, the day before our death. Well, most of us don't actually know when we're going to die, and part of the subtext is it's good to sort of clean the slate frequently and regularly, and when there are issues to address, and not wait. And in many ways, as with the mission of the Shomer Collective, advanced planning is good, and some of the kinds of questions that come up around the end of life are good to address at any time, but certainly when we are aware of the possibility of approaching mortality, of aging, of frailty, of increasing limitation that may constrain us in the foreseeable future, or ahead of the foreseeable future. And so it's, if somebody's dealing with this a life constraining, life shaping, potentially life threatening illness, or a terminal illness, a chronic situation, as one is comfortable, as one thinks about the questions of mortality and end of life, it may or may not be medically appropriate to think about, hospice per se. Am I hospice eligible, or when to enroll? But thinking about, what do I want? What's going to be important to me? What will be comforting to me? What do I want those who are close to me? What do I want their experience to be? What am I concerned about? What am I worried will happen to me? What kind of support should be in place? So to be considering those questions, for which again, hospice may be a part of the support answer for some people, and for some people it may not be. And then, so when there's not I'm not drawing on a specific Jewish text because the idea of 6 months in hospice and Medicare, that's much more recent than some of the texts that we draw on
Yes.
typically. But there's a tonality about alleviating distress for people and alleviating mental suffering. And to the extent that a person, one of us, or somebody we care about, is at the point in life where they're starting to be concerned more and more about where this is headed and what the future is, and or not wanting to be a burden on my loved ones, and that language is coming up, those thoughts and concerns are coming up and more, then it's time to at least think about where am I in relation medically to end of life, and what kind of supports, whether it's the kind of things that hospice provides, or in-home care, or an end-of-life doula, or an in-home volunteer, because it's certainly helpful to have those conversations. And I'll add that the relationships are so important. When you have a doula who's helping you, when you have an end of life or a home care volunteer or a professional who's working with you, and they just come in when everything's chaotic, that can be a great help, but it's not. But the more ideal situation is to develop those relationships and for them to get to know you as early as possible, so that when you have more needs, they already have it, or perhaps are impaired in your ability to communicate or do some things for yourself. They have more of an understanding of what is really going to help, and who you are, and what your preferences are, and how they can serve that.
Right. Right. So related question in terms of things to talk about in advance. There's a question here about, in your experience, do you use, the question says your chaplain work, but I would just say all of the work that you do working with people and with families, as also an opportunity to talk about after death care and rituals, because often people don't want to think about that part just as much as we don't think about, what kind of hospice care, what kind of end of life things might be meaningful. Even more so, sometimes people don't want to talk about what happens after the death. So, do you do those conversations, and how do you find ways to weave that in to the work you do?
Those can be really helpful conversations. I find that it varies so much. Some people really want to talk about what I want at the end of life and don't want to talk about after, don't want to think about the grief that some of their loved ones will be experiencing when they're gone, or the unfinished business that's going to be left behind,
Right.
which can be profound issues. Some people are much more comfortable actually thinking, I want to be buried in the same cemetery where my grandparents are, or I want to be cremated, or I want to, there's lots of, and I want this to go to this person, and I want that message to go to that person, and that is much more clear than facing our frailty, our mortality, our dying process. So, so either one can be an entree to the other. I like to start with the one that feels more accessible and more timely for people, and then having established a degree of rapport, a degree of comfort, a sense of accomplishment or progress, then to at least raise the question of, this is kind of related. Would it be helpful to address that as well for yourself or for your loved ones?
This person says, I have found that with Jewish families, there can be a split among siblings or among family members, with some thinking that hospice is hastening death, and they wait until the last minute to get this type of help. How do we ease this concern? And I think, this is a common question. And it gets to this underlying question that, in Judaism, we cherish life, right? We say choose life. And we have this directive to keep people, right, to keep people alive. And often hospice feels like giving up. Right. And so how do you balance that when different people in for a person, but also when different people in the family or in the caregiving group, we should say, have different feelings and opinions about that?
Yeah. So there are some interesting classical Jewish texts about end of life that are really end of life, usually not at the moment when somebody is entering hospice, but really more their final hours that talk about the extreme care that we take not to hasten death, but also that it's okay to remove impediments from dying and to provide comfort
Mhm.
and to alleviate suffering. So that's part of the background. And hospice philosophy is not about hastening death. And it's not about giving up. It's about a change in focus from trying to do everything possible or whatever we were doing to keep somebody's physical functioning um, and comfort and other things. It's not only about curing things, curing our ailments, but it's about increasingly about comfort as well and understanding about pain and pain management. But hospice has a particular focus on, again, holistic care, the whole system, the person not only as patient, but a person who has a whole life with all kinds of other connections and people, core people in it. And hospice has a particular expertise and experience around managing anxiety and pain, alleviating that kind of distress. And hospice has a little bit more leeway because it is dealing with people who are medically near the end of their lives. There's a little bit more leeway, or hospice providers often feel like they have more latitude to, for instance, give higher amounts of medication, higher doses of medication than might be given in a hospital where they're concerned about somebody becoming addicted, let's say, to a pain medication because they're not at the end of their life. They have other, and
Right.
the impacts of that could be more deleterious.
Yeah.
So hospice has more flexibility to address a number of issues, but it is focused on quality of life more than medical sustenance, not necessarily turning away from, but if somebody's on hospice and says, I want to die at home and I want the support to be comfortable, is generally not going to be rushed off to the emergency room for all kinds of high intensity care. So it's a change in philosophy and approach, but it's not giving up. It's saying, for me, quality of life now means this, whereas before maybe the emphasis was more on that, on treatments, and now it's going to be on comfort measures.
Yeah.
So I would just, but there is a common concern about giving up, about hastening death, about ending care in a certain way. And I don't want to say that it's a myth because it is a change. And for some people to say, I'm giving up on on chemotherapy,
Mhm.
or I'm giving up on, I'm going to have a DNR. I'm not going to ask for a CPR anymore if my heart stops. And instead, I want to focus that you are giving up something. You're giving up a level of care and a kind of part of the medical infrastructure in favor of something else.
Right. For me, the story that I always come back to, I think of two things, right? I think of, in Jewish tradition, there's kind of the folk superstitions about, we don't want to talk about this because the angel of death will hear us, and it's like we're welcoming the angel of death by talking about it. So I've
Poo,
heard
poo,
people
poo.
say that, right? Poo, 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 tfu, 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 I'll spit over my shoulder, all the things. Bli ayin hara, right? All the things that we do to keep the angel of death away. So you have that on the one hand, and then you have, and these are coming from what I'm about to say comes from a completely different part of Jewish life. That's from one part of Jewish kind of cultural life. And then you have the story of, I want to say it's Rabbi Yochanan, right, in The Handmaid, who drops the jug
Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi,
Rabbi
Judah.
Yehuda
Judah the
Nasi.
Great.
Okay, I got
Yes.
my rabbis mixed up. But the Talmudic story of the great rabbi who is suffering, who is dying and suffering, and the students are praying and praying for healing, and the handmaid or the house servant realizes that the students are keeping him alive and he's suffering, and drops something very loudly and distracts them. And in that moment, right, his soul leaves because there was quiet for a split second. And that story, which is another text that kind of tells us it's okay, right? It's okay sometimes for someone to go. That's the less painful option. So those are the ones that come to me, those kind of different messages that our tradition gives to us.
If I can just add a
Please.
couple of other texts,
Yeah,
the last line of Adon Olam, as many synagogue services end with this hymn is, "And into your hands I commend my body and my spirit." Uh, the you being God, the eternal. Um, there's something about hospice that is about trying to exert a certain kind of control and focus in one's life, and also about letting go. And it's not necessarily saying I want to die, I want to hasten my death, but acknowledging I'm not in full control anymore. When are we? We have an illusion of being in control most of the time. We get lots of reminders during the day and the weeks or in our lives. Sometimes that's not the case.
right.
But when we're at the end of our lives, sometimes it's a little more clear, and certain things become more important to us. And a lot of people at the end of their lives come to a point, whether out of their desire or by hook or by crook, of or feeling I have no choice now. I have to let go of this. I can't do that anymore. I can't go out and do something I used to do. I can't control something. I can't even manage my own medications or finances anymore. I mean, there can be, some people don't go through that process, and for some people, there are many forms of letting go that take place before we come to our last breath. And part of the blessing of having care and support through that process is comfort and accompaniment in that, not going through it alone, the emotional, the spiritual aspects of that letting go. And also there can be relief with some of that. Don't have to worry about this anymore. And there can be grief too.
Yeah.
And having that recognized and supported, and having space to mourn what is ending, what's being let go of, can be, from a spiritual perspective, very important and very healing.
Mhm. What you were just saying about having the support and the caregiving around you that hospice can provide. One of the questions that comes up a lot is, what about people who don't have family or whose family is far away? We live in a very mobile society and a very often isolated society. And what kinds of options are available, and what role can spiritual support play for people who are in that position?
So I would say, first of all, spiritual care is not only something that's offered by professionally trained spiritual caregivers. Our friends, our pets, our, loved ones in our lives, may be sources both of consternation, but also profound spiritual support. All the things that we've been talking about up until now. So sometimes it's an important shift, as with opting for hospice. It can be an important shift to say, oh, I'm in a vulnerable place right now and I could use help. And I've been a caregiver throughout my life. I'm throwing out an example that's a common one, not the only one. And to get to that place, that soft, maybe vulnerable place of letting others know I'm struggling with something, I could use help. So whether it's family, friends, community members, to say, I need to lean on some of you, or can I, here's a little bit of a smorgasbord, a menu of possibilities. Can you help me with this or that? And it could be a ride to an appointment, a meal, time to get visiting time together, running interference with something in the healthcare, someone in the healthcare system. So there are lots of ways that informally we can provide that to one another. People who don't have that kind of informal friend, family, local, communal support system can contract with or can seek out help from local organizations. Again, end-of-life doulas, not only hospice providers, sometimes there are family services or community agencies that offer home visiting and home supports of various kinds. So there, and if one is connected with a synagogue, sometimes they're synagogue volunteers, caring committee members, who can not only visit, but are aware of some of the other resources in the community. So sometimes it takes one or two points of contact, then help connect with, or identify other resources that you hadn't been thinking about or aware of in your local community.
Yeah. And someone commented in the chat, sometimes strangers are actually better. People are more comfortable talking to strangers, to volunteers, to other people on the hospice team than they might be to the people in their families, or their, close communities. So these things can be very individual and very complicated.
And these days we're not limited to only somebody who can be with us in person. So there's phone and video connections that allow us to access resources, people we care about, or new, spiritual directors, doulas or counselors online that can be of great comfort to somebody who's otherwise shut in or isolated.
Right. And the comment I see right now coming in is that, yes, a dying person requires the same level of care as an infant, often physical care. And that is why it is so important to have a team of people, whatever that looks like, and whatever combinations of people can be brought in to provide that support. It's not something that, any one family member or one caregiver can provide at all. I want to make sure I get to a couple of questions that came in, which are about, as I said, post death. And I'll just share, there's two questions and I'll just share them both and then you can respond. One is about chevra kadisha, the caring societies who prepare the bodies for burial. But how do we get more people to understand the importance of it and to be interested in the training and in volunteering and in providing this service to those who want it? How do we change the culture around that? And then a related question, but very, very different in some ways, is chevra kadisha is very much, for people who choose one type of post-death care for the body. And it can go with burial. It usually goes with burial, but the other question that came up is about cremation. What can be done when someone is asking for cremation? Someone has expressed their wish that they want cremation, which can goes against Jewish tradition, and some rabbis think is a sin. What do we do? How do we balance that in those situations? And again, these are two separate questions, but I feel like they go together and that they're looking at, how do we care for people? How do we care for bodies after death? And how do we respect people's wishes for what they may want?
So one of the through lines of all this is about values and communication. And to the extent that we have clarity on what we want or what we don't know, but have questions and can put those into words, when we start to talk about them, other questions come up, but also sometimes information comes our way. And anybody who might be a resource or who might be somebody who's potentially carrying out our wishes, to start those conversations. Maybe the hardest part, once they've started, a lot of iterations may come forth that are much more helpful. So Chevra Kadisha, in terms of publicizing, Shomer Collective is one of the organizations that is doing that. Kavod V'Nichum, there's sort of a resurgence of interest in end of life and postmortem care in the Jewish community, those not only the sacred rituals, but that web of support for within the community and for the people who've died and for the ones who their loved ones, those who will be coming to a funeral or memorial. There are some chevra kadisha, there's some burial societies, there's some Jewish funeral homes that will conduct a tahar, allow chevra kadisha to take care of the body through the purification rituals, even though a person is opting for cremation. There are some funeral homes in the country that will even take care of the cremation, and there are some who say no, we don't do that. And there are rabbis in the community who, as you mentioned, say that goes against our halakha, that goes against tradition, and especially after the Holocaust. And there are some because also there are parts of the Jewish community culturally for whom cremation was actually a preferred way to go for various reasons, and particularly in the more liberal community in the Reform world, even if that's not held up as a value, it's held up as a very viable option that just sociologically speaking, a much higher percentage of the community is opted in that direction. And so there's an interplay there. And again, communicating and knowing what your community is comfortable with or what your family is comfortable with. And if there are, especially if there's some conflict in values, being clear when you have a red line for your own wishes or where you're flexible or what you would like for yourself before it's a critical, timely conversation, can just make so much difference for the tone and the energy and the relationships that follow.
Okay. We are coming to the end of our time there. I know there were more questions we didn't get to. I apologize to those if we didn't get to your questions, but please feel free to write to us. Thank you, Natan, so much for this conversation and for the work you do in the world. And Melanie, turn things back to you.
Thank you, Gila, for facilitating tonight's conversation. Thank you, Natan. Thank you all for participating, for sharing information about our work with others and bringing new faces in. We welcome your feedback. I put a link to an evaluation, quick evaluation in the chat. If you might click on it and tell us what more you're looking for, what you thought of this evening, it'll help guide the direction for our future programs. I also put a link to our upcoming programs, including one more before Passover, that may help you to find your way through the journey from narrow places toward more expansiveness as we experience liberation of sorts on Passover. We look forward to seeing you there and at any other programs. And I also put in the chat for questions. Feel free to email us, hello@shomercollective.org. If you need help beyond the things that came up this evening, happy to respond to you individually. hello@shomercollective.org. So good to be with all of you this evening. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.